My brother Eli and I hadn't spoken much in the past few years. Not because we fought, but because life got in the way. He had his family, and I had my career. As time drifted on, so did we, floating in our separate orbits, only occasionally brushing past one another. But that changed when we both received the letter. It was a simple envelope, yellowed at the edges like something that had been forgotten for too long. My name, written in our mother's delicate handwriting, stared up at me as if time hadn't touched her at all. The letter inside was brief, too brief, just a request for us to visit. She didn't explain why, just that she needed to see us, and that she was living in a small village at the foot of some mountain range I'd never heard of. I remember standing in my kitchen, the letter trembling in my hands. We hadn't seen or heard from her in years. Ever since she'd moved away after Dad died, she'd drifted out of our lives. We assumed she wanted to be alone. She never gave any indication that she wanted visitors. And now, out of the blue, this letter. Eli called me the next day, his voice shaking in a way I hadn't heard since we were kids. "You got one too, right?" he asked, without even bothering to say hello. "Yeah, I got one," I replied, staring at the letter again, as if it might explain itself if I looked hard enough. "She's been gone for so long. Why now?" Eli's voice held an edge of something I couldn't place. Fear? Confusion? It was hard to tell. "I don't know," I said, "but we have to go." The village was exactly what you'd imagine from a place nestled in the shadow of old mountains, quaint, isolated, and eerily quiet. The houses were small, many of them looking as though they hadn't been touched by modern hands for decades. Ivy crawled up stone walls, and the roads were uneven with cracks running through them like veins. Eli and I arrived together, driving up in his beat-up truck that had seen better days. The moment we stepped out, something felt wrong. There was no sound, no birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just silence. The air hung heavy with a stillness that pressed against my skin like a weight. As we made our way through the village, I noticed the looks. The locals, few as they were, stood at their doors or peered through their windows, eyes wide with curiosity. Or was it fear? Eli noticed too. He shifted uncomfortably beside me, his gaze darting to the villagers. "You feel that?" he asked quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Yeah," I muttered, keeping my eyes ahead. "They don't like us being here." We approached a small group of elderly villagers, sitting on a bench by what seemed like an abandoned shop. Their expressions grew darker as we drew closer. One of them, a wiry man with a shock of white hair, rose to his feet, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his eyes never quite meeting mine. Eli exchanged a look with me before stepping forward. "We're here to see our mother," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. The man's lips pressed into a thin line. "No one lives in that part of the village anymore." The words hit me like a punch. I felt Eli tense beside me. "That's impossible," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "We've been getting letters from her for months." The man shook his head slowly. "No one lives there," he repeated, almost as if he were trying to convince himself of it. A shiver ran down my spine. Something about the way he said it, so final, so certain, made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Without another word, Eli and I left the villagers behind, heading in the direction our mother's letter had indicated. The road grew narrower as we walked, the houses fewer and farther apart. Soon, there were no houses at all, just the remnants of what once might have been a lively part of the village. The air seemed to grow colder, though it wasn't particularly chilly. It was the kind of cold that creeps into your bones and stays there. And then, we saw it. Our mother's house sat at the end of the road, standing proudly amid the decay that surrounded it. Unlike the other buildings, which were cracked and crumbling, her house was pristine, as if it had been plucked from another time and placed here, untouched by the years. The windows were clean, the paint on the shutters fresh. The garden, if you could call it that, was perfectly manicured. It was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. "She's here," Eli said, though his voice lacked the conviction I would have expected. I nodded, but my stomach twisted in knots. The silence around us felt unnatural, oppressive. It was as if the house existed in its own little world, separate from everything else. As we approached, I noticed something strange. There was no sound, no wind in the trees, no distant hum of insects, nothing. Even our footsteps felt muffled, as if the earth beneath us was absorbing the noise. We stood in front of the door, both of us hesitating. Eli looked at me, his expression a mix of fear and confusion. "You ready?" he asked. I swallowed hard. "Let's get this over with." I knocked, my knuckles barely making a sound against the wood. After a few moments, the door swung open and there she was, our mother, standing in the doorway, smiling. At first glance, she looked exactly as I remembered her, tall and elegant, her hair pulled back into a neat bun. She hadn't aged a day since we last saw her. Not a single wrinkle, not a single gray hair. It was as if time had stopped for her. But there was something off. Her smile never wavered, not even when she saw us, and her eyes. There was something distant about them, like she was looking through us rather than at us. "Tom, Eli," she said, her voice calm and even. "It's so good to see you." Her tone didn't match her words. There was no warmth, no emotion behind them. Eli and I exchanged a quick glance, but neither of us said anything. We stepped inside, and as soon as we did, I felt it. The air was thick with a kind of tension that I couldn't explain. The house was immaculate, just like the exterior. Everything was in its place, clean and perfect. But there was an unnatural stillness to it. The kind of stillness that made your skin crawl. Our mother closed the door behind us, her movements slow and deliberate. She turned to us, still smiling that same eerie smile. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice soft, but there was no joy in it. "We got your letters," Eli said, his voice strained. "Why didn't you call or anything?" Her smile didn't falter. "It's a quiet place here, very peaceful, no need for phones." The way she said it sent a chill down my spine. I glanced at Eli, who was watching her with a frown. "Mom," I started, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's going on here? The villagers, they said no one lives here anymore." Her eyes flicked toward the window for a brief moment before returning to us. "It's a quiet place," she repeated. "Very peaceful." The exact same words, the exact same tone. Eli took a step forward, his voice shaking. "Mom, what's wrong? You're acting—" "I'm fine," she interrupted, still smiling. "Everything is fine. It's a quiet place, very peaceful." The air seemed to grow colder, and I felt a pit form in my stomach. Something was very, very wrong. Eli shifted beside me, his eyes narrowing as our mother stood there, still smiling, still repeating the same phrase over and over. His hand found my arm, gripping it tighter than I expected, and for a moment I thought he might lose it. "Mom?" Eli tried again, this time more forcefully. "We need real answers. What's going on here? Why didn't you reach out before?" Her eyes fixed on him, her smile unwavering. The silence stretched between us, uncomfortable and thick. Then she finally spoke. "It's quiet here," she said again, her voice even softer this time. "Very peaceful." I felt a shiver run down my spine. There was no variation in her tone. It was like speaking to an automated message, something programmed to respond in a loop. My chest tightened with a growing sense of dread. Eli let go of my arm and took a cautious step closer to her. "Mom, stop it. You're scaring us." For a moment, something flickered across her face, a brief shadow of emotion, a flicker of recognition maybe. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. Her head tilted slightly, and she looked at him with those hollow eyes. "I've missed you both," she said, her smile widening, but the words felt rehearsed. "You should stay. It's been so long since we've been together." Eli turned to me, panic starting to edge into his voice. "Tom, something's wrong. This isn't..." She isn't. I know, I whispered, cutting him off before he could finish. I can feel it too. Our mother stood in front of us, her hands folded neatly in front of her, waiting. It was unnerving, the way she just stood there, staring at us with that frozen smile. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing added up. Suddenly, Eli's expression changed, his brows furrowing as if he'd just noticed something. "Tom," he said, his voice low, "look at her shadow." I glanced down, and my heart skipped a beat. Her shadow, cast by the dim light in the hallway, wasn't moving in sync with her. As she stood there, still and motionless, the shadow behind her seemed to shift ever so slightly, as if it had a life of its own. It rippled, elongated almost like it was breathing. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath, stepping back instinctively. Eli reached out, his voice strained. "Mom, what's happening here?" She didn't respond. For the first time since we arrived, her smile faltered. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Her eyes grew vacant, and then, without warning, she froze completely, mid-motion, mid-sentence, as if she'd simply shut down. Eli's breath caught in his throat. "Tom, what's happening?" he asked, his voice shaking with barely contained fear. I stepped toward her cautiously, reaching out to touch her shoulder. The moment my hand brushed her skin, I jerked back. Her body was cold, ice cold, like touching stone. Eli backed away, wide-eyed. "This isn't right. This isn't Mom." I glanced at him, my own fear reflecting in his eyes. "We need to figure out what's going on." Before we could say anything more, our mother blinked back to life. Slowly, her head tilted toward us, and that unsettling smile returned, as if nothing had happened. "I'm so glad you're here," she said, her voice back to that same flat, eerie tone. "It's a quiet place, very peaceful." We spent the next few hours exploring the house. It hadn't changed at all since we were kids. The same wallpaper, the same furniture. Everything was exactly as we remembered, except for the fact that it felt more like a museum than a home. There was no warmth here, no life. It was as though time had stood still, preserving the place in some strange, unnatural stasis. Eli and I didn't speak much. We didn't need to. The silence between us was enough to convey the shared unease that gnawed at us both. In one of the rooms, I found an old family photograph. It was tucked away in a drawer, half buried beneath a stack of old papers. I pulled it out, my breath catching in my throat as I looked at it. It was a picture of the three of us, me, Eli, and Mom, taken decades ago, long before she'd moved away. But what chilled me to the core wasn't the nostalgic memory captured in the image. It was that she looked exactly the same in the photograph as she did now. The same smooth skin, the same youthful face, not a single sign of aging. I stared at the photo, my mind racing. How could she look the same after all these years? My hands shook as I turned the picture over, half expecting there to be some sort of explanation scrawled on the back. But it was blank. Eli came up behind me, glancing over my shoulder. "What is it?" he asked. I handed him the photo wordlessly. He studied it for a moment, and I watched as the color drained from his face. "This isn't right," he muttered. "This can't be right." "She hasn't aged, Eli," I said quietly. "Not a single day." Eli looked at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. What does that mean? How is that even possible?" "I don't know," I whispered, "but we need answers." That night, Eli and I decided to stay. I don't know why, we both felt the wrongness of the place, the creeping sensation that something was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to reveal itself. But we couldn't leave. Not yet. Not without understanding what was happening. As we lay in the old bedroom we used to share as kids, the silence in the house became suffocating. There were no sounds from outside, no wind, no animals, nothing. It was as though the house existed in a bubble of stillness. Then the whispers began. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by the oppressive quiet. But soon the murmurs grew louder, though still faint, like voices speaking from just behind the walls. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to Eli, who was lying awake beside me. He nodded, his face pale in the darkness. "It's coming from the walls." We both sat up, straining to hear. The voices were low, hushed, but familiar in a way that sent chills racing down my spine. They sounded like our mother, and sometimes they sounded like us. Not the versions of ourselves that were here now, but younger versions, distorted and strange. I got out of bed and pressed my ear to the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. The voices were clearer now, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. It was like listening to a conversation from another room, too muffled to fully understand, but just distinct enough to know it was there. Eli joined me, his face twisted in confusion and fear. "What the hell is this?" I shook my head, my stomach churning with dread. "I don't know." The whispers grew louder, overlapping, filling the air with a cacophony of disjointed words and phrases. I pulled back, my heart racing. Something wasn't right. Something was terribly wrong. Eli stared at me, his face pale. "Tom, we need to get out of here. This place, it's not safe." I nodded, but before I could say anything, there was a sudden thump from somewhere in the house. It was a soft sound, like something falling or something moving. We both froze, our breath catching in our throats. "What was that?" Eli whispered. The house seemed to hold its breath with us. The whispers from the walls stopped, and for a moment everything was deathly silent. Then from somewhere down the hall we heard a voice, our mother's voice. "Everything is fine," she called out. "It's a quiet place, very peaceful." Her voice, drifting through the house like a phantom, was calm and steady. Too calm, too steady. It didn't carry the warmth or reassurance we once knew. Instead, it echoed unnervingly, as though it wasn't coming from her at all but from the walls themselves. Eli and I exchanged a glance, our breaths shallow and uneven. There was no way we were going back to sleep after that. Without a word, we crept out of the room and into the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath our feet. The house seemed to groan around us, the silence pressing in from all sides. I felt like we were being watched, by the house itself, or by something within it. The whispering had returned, but now it was quieter, subtler, like a distant murmur that we couldn't escape. "She's not herself, Tom," Eli whispered, his voice trembling. "Whatever that thing is, it's not her." I nodded, my mind racing. "I know, but we need to figure out what's going on before we do anything rash." We made our way toward the living room, where the soft glow of a single lamp cast long shadows on the walls. The room looked untouched, like a snapshot frozen in time, but the air was thick with tension, almost as if the house itself was waiting for something, some awful realization we hadn't yet made. As we moved further into the house, my gaze landed on a stack of letters on the mantel. They were unopened, sealed in old envelopes with my mother's handwriting on the front. My stomach tightened. These looked just like the ones we'd received, but something about them was different. I stepped closer and reached for the top letter, the paper brittle under my fingers. The date on it was from months ago, before we'd even started getting letters from her. "Eli, look at this," I said, my voice low and strained. "These letters, they're old." Eli came over, peering over my shoulder. "But how? We've been getting letters from her for months." I carefully opened the letter, and my blood ran cold as I read the first few lines. "Tom, Eli, there's something wrong with the house. I can't explain it, but I don't feel safe here. Please, don't come. I'm afraid." The ink was smeared in places, as if written in haste. My hands trembled as I turned to Eli. She didn't want us to come here." Eli took the letter from my hands, his face pale as he read the words for himself. "But we did. And now we're stuck here." I rifled through the other letters, finding more of the same. Warnings, pleas for help, messages filled with fear and dread. None of these letters had ever reached us. Instead, we'd received simple notes. asking us to visit, urging us to come to this place. It didn't make sense. I don't understand, I muttered. Why would she ask us to come if she was afraid of the house? Eli didn't respond. He was staring at the last letter in the pile, his face ashen. I followed his gaze and saw that the words were shifting. The ink bled across the page, rearranging itself into new sentences right before our eyes. The letter no longer contained our mother's words. Instead, it was a message from something else, something that had taken her place. Welcome home, boys. She belongs to the house now, and so do you. I dropped the letter as if it had burned me, my heart pounding in my chest. Eli backed away, his hands shaking. Tom, what the hell is going on here? Before I could answer, we heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming down the hallway toward us. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned toward the sound, half expecting to see our mother, or whatever was pretending to be her, standing there, watching us. But the hallway was empty. Still, the footsteps continued, growing louder, closer, until they seemed to surround us. It felt like the house was alive, breathing and moving around us. The walls whispered, the floor creaked, and in every shadow, I imagined eyes staring back. Eli grabbed my arm. We need to get out of here, now. I didn't argue. We made our way to the front door, our footsteps quick and desperate. But just as we reached it, something stopped me in my tracks. A faint reflection in the hallway mirror caught my eye. It wasn't us. In the mirror, Eli and I were standing where we were now, but there was something wrong with the reflections. They were off. Our movements were delayed, like old film footage skipping frames. Worse still, the version of myself in the mirror was holding something. A knife. I blinked, my heart racing. I wasn't holding a knife. But in the reflection, I was. And my reflection, my other self, was walking toward Eli, the blade raised, eyes dark and vacant. Tom, Eli said urgently, pulling at my sleeve. Come on, let's go. I tore my gaze away from the mirror and followed Eli, my mind reeling. What the hell had I just seen? Was it a warning, a hallucination, or something else? We burst through the front door, into the cold night air. But the moment we stepped outside, the silence hit us again. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was like the world had been muted. Eli gasped for breath beside me, his eyes wide with panic. We need to leave, Tom. We need to get out of this village. I nodded, but something in the back of my mind told me it wasn't that simple. The house, whatever it was, had a hold on us now. It wasn't going to let us go that easily. As we stood there, trying to gather our thoughts, I felt a strange sensation wash over me. My body felt heavy, like something was pulling me down, dragging me back toward the house. I tried to shake it off, but the weight only grew stronger, more insistent. And then I realized I couldn't hear Eli anymore. I turned to him, panic rising in my chest. His lips were moving, but no sound came out. He was shouting, his face twisted in fear, but I couldn't hear a single word. It was like we had been swallowed by the silence. I reached for him, but as I did, I noticed something else. Eli's movements were slowing down. His steps became sluggish, his arms hanging at his sides like they were weighed down by invisible chains. And then his eyes, those wide, terrified eyes, began to glaze over, his face going slack. Eli! I shouted, but no sound escaped my lips. I tried to scream again, but it was useless. The silence was absolute. I watched in horror as Eli's body stiffened, his movements growing robotic, mechanical. It was like he was being consumed by the house, pulled into its twisted version of reality. His eyes, once filled with life, were now cold and empty. I grabbed his arm, but it was too late. Eli wasn't Eli anymore. He was just another part of the silence. I backed away, my heart pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The house loomed behind me, dark and looming like it was watching, waiting. And that's when I realized, if I didn't leave now, I'd be next. I stumbled backward, the realization slamming into me like a wave. Eli, my brother, was gone. The man standing before me, stiff and hollow-eyed, wasn't him anymore. He had been taken by whatever darkness was festering inside that house, and I was next if I didn't find a way out. The silence that had enveloped the world around me was suffocating. It pressed against my ears, a thick, oppressive force that made my skin crawl. The house behind me seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, breathing in sync with the unnatural quiet. The whispers that once lingered on the edge of my hearing were gone, leaving only the crushing absence of sound. I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the dirt road leading back into the village, though I couldn't hear the rhythm of my own steps. Every sense of reality had been muted, and the harder I tried to listen for something, anything, the more my world narrowed into this terrifying void. Behind me I could feel the pull of the house. It was like a presence lurking just beyond my vision, urging me to turn back, to surrender to its strange, silent grip. But I wouldn't. I couldn't. I had to get out. I had to survive. The village was a blur as I ran past, its streets empty and lifeless. The houses stood like silent sentinels, their windows dark, their doors shut tight against the growing madness that seemed to hang over everything. I ran until my legs ached, until my lungs burned. But no matter how far I went, that weight, that pull, followed me. Eventually I collapsed at the edge of the village, gasping for breath. My knees hit the ground and I doubled over, my hands shaking as I clutched at the earth beneath me. The silence still held, a constant reminder of the nightmare I couldn't escape. I glanced back, half expecting to see Eli, or whatever he had become, following me. But there was nothing. Just the empty road leading back to our mother's house, now distant and shrouded in shadow. I couldn't see it anymore, but I could feel it. And then, the whispers returned. This time, they were closer. Clearer, they were inside me, in my mind. I pressed my hands against my ears, but it didn't matter. They were there, gnawing at my thoughts, twisting my memories. And worse, they weren't only whispers now. They were familiar voices. Tom. It was Eli's voice, his real voice, not the lifeless version that had been consumed by the house. But it sounded distant, as though coming from another time, another place. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out. No, this isn't real, I muttered to myself, but my own voice was drowned out by the whispers. Eli's voice, my mother's voice, even my own voice from when I was younger, all tangled together in a cacophony of madness. "Come back, Tom," Eli's voice urged. "We're waiting for you." I shook my head violently, trying to dispel the thoughts, but it only grew worse. The images flashed through my mind. Eli standing still and silent, his eyes glazed over. Our mother, smiling that frozen smile, her shadow moving when she didn't. The letters, twisted and rewritten by something I couldn't understand. The whispers began to distort, the voices warping into something darker. My mother's voice became hollow, lifeless, as though it was being pulled from a deep, endless void. Eli's voice cracked, repeating the same phrases over and over, like a broken record. "Come back, come back, come back!" I screamed, but the sound never left my lips. My throat burned from the effort, but there was nothing, not even the echo of my own desperation. I stumbled to my feet, my vision blurry and disoriented. I had to get further away. I had to leave the village entirely. Maybe if I got far enough, the whispers would stop. Maybe I could escape whatever force was dragging me back toward that cursed house. I stumbled through the outskirts of the village, my legs weak and unsteady. The air felt thicker here, colder, as if the closer I got to leaving, the more the house resisted. It was like I was tethered to it, an invisible thread pulling tighter and tighter the further I went. And then I saw it. Just ahead, at the edge of the village, was an old, weathered sign. Its paint was peeling, and the words were barely legible. But I recognized it from when we had first arrived. "Welcome to Silver Pines." But something was wrong. The sign had changed. The words weren't welcoming anymore. They had warped, rearranged themselves into something far more sinister. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the new message, painted in what looked like dried, darkened blood. There is no leaving. My stomach twisted and I stumbled back, my pulse hammering in my ears. The sign seemed to loom over me, its message seeping into my bones. I turned away, panic flooding my senses. And then, as if to confirm my worst fear, the silence around me broke with a single word. Not a whisper, not a murmur, but a voice, clear and cold, echoing from behind me. "Come back, Tom." I turned, my heart in my throat. Standing there at the edge of the village was our mother, or what used to be her. She was smiling that same unnerving smile, her eyes dark and empty, and behind her, standing just as still, was Eli. They weren't moving, they were waiting for me. The sight of them, my mother and Eli, standing side by side at the edge of the village, their expressions frozen in those eerie smiles, made my blood run cold. They didn't blink, didn't move, didn't speak again. They simply stood there, waiting. And then, I heard her voice again, clear and soft, so familiar. "Tom, don't leave us." It was my mother, the real her. For a split second, her voice sounded like it always had, warm and gentle, filled with the love I remembered from my childhood. It froze me in place. What if she's still in there? What if she needs me? The thought flashed through my mind, conflicting with the terror that was clawing at my chest. What if all of this, the strange silence, the whispers, the distortions, was just the house playing tricks? My heart raced as I looked back at the figures in the distance. My mother stood there, her hand outstretched toward me, her expression softening, almost pleading now. Eli stood beside her, his smile faltering, his eyes wide and frightened, like the brother I knew. "Tom," Eli's voice called out. It was his real voice this time. "Please don't leave me." I took a hesitant step toward them, my heart wrenching in my chest. I couldn't leave them. I shouldn't leave them. But then, something shifted in the air, and the illusion cracked. Their faces twitched, just for a moment, but it was enough. The smile on my mother's lips stretched too far, her eyes darkening to something cold and lifeless again. Eli's face twisted, his wide eyes no longer pleading but dull, vacant. Like puppets whose strings had been yanked, their movements were just wrong. The warmth I'd felt from them vanished in an instant, replaced by the cold, suffocating presence of whatever force had taken hold of them. "No," I whispered, my voice breaking. "You're not them." I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I looked back, I knew I'd lose whatever fragile grasp on reality I still had. My feet pounded against the dirt road, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the world blurring around me as I fled. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get away, from the house, from the village, from them. I stumbled forward, desperate to escape. My breath came in shallow gasps as the air thickened around me, and I could feel the house's presence growing stronger, even here, outside the village. And then I saw her again. Standing just ahead, in the shadows between the trees, was my mother. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her expression was blank, empty, and her eyes were cold, devoid of any recognition. "Tom," she said, her voice hollow. "Come back. You belong with us now." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Behind her, more figures began to appear. Eli and others, people I didn't recognize. They all had the same vacant expressions, the same lifeless eyes. They stood there, waiting, watching. And the figures in the distance began to move, their bodies jerking unnaturally as they stepped toward me. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest, each footfall feeling heavier than the last. They were all pulling at me, calling me back into that twisted reality, into that suffocating silence. But I wouldn't stop. I couldn't stop. My legs burned as I pushed forward, my breath ragged and shallow. My vision was blurry from exhaustion, the dark shapes of the forest shifting and warping as I struggled to focus. I had no idea where I was running, just that I had to get as far away from the house as possible. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't need to see the house again to know it was still there. I knew deep down that the house wouldn't disappear. It would stay hidden in the shadows, pulling in whoever was unfortunate enough to come near. But I wasn't going to let it take me, not today. As I stumbled away from the village, the whispers faded, but they didn't disappear entirely. They lingered just on the edge of my hearing like a faint reminder of the nightmare I had escaped. I knew they would never leave me, not completely. The house had left its mark, and I would carry it with me for the rest of my life. But I was alive, and I was free.